There's something about sleeping near a river that makes you feel both clean and completely exposed at the same time. The water had been talking all night, not loudly, just insistently. A steady rushing over stones, a constant whisper of movement. When I woke, the sky was still pale and undecided. The air had that early morning chill that sneaks under your sleeves and reminds you you're not in Tennessee anymore. The forest around us was dense, but not oppressive. Tall trees with silver bark rose like pillars, their branches filtering the dawn into a greenish haze. The undergrowth was thick in places, thorny shrubs, low aromatic herbs crushed beneath our boots the day before. The scent lingered in the air, sharp, resinous, almost medicinal. Francis was already awake. Of course he was. He stood near the riverbank, barefoot, trousers rolled halfway up his calves. He was staring into the current as if it had just told him something important. His habit, though unmistakably medieval, somehow never looked out of place. He always looked like it belonged where he stood. Morning, I said, easing myself upright. He turned with that quick, bright smile that always feels like it's for you and only you. Good morning, Alice Kay. The river's very industrious today. It's doing its job, I asked. He tilted his head. Perhaps, or perhaps it is trying to. Behind us, I could hear David's sleeping bag zipper and the faint clatter of metal from someone's pack. Prill gave one low, satisfied snort from where she had been curled at my feet, and then rose, stretching like a baked potato splitting open. The others emerged slowly, Mom adjusting her scarf, Dad already standing straight-backed as if he'd been awake for an hour. Lucia blinking into the light. Aoife tying her long, wavy auburn hair into a high, practical knot. I've read Anne of Green Gables too many times to call Aoife's hair red. Maria, Sean, and Liam had slept a little apart from the main circle, the three of them forming their own small island of energy. They were whispering and laughing about something as they packed up. Teresa of Avila was sitting on a rock, hands folded, looking not at the river, but into the trees beyond it, as though she could see through them. John of the Cross stood beside her, quieter, hands tucked into his sleeves. Before we start walking, Mom announced cheerfully, we have a problem. Everyone froze. What kind of problem? David asked. The kind that smells, she said, and clipped her nose as if she had a clothespin. That got our attention. Mom looked at the river. We've been walking for days. We've sweated. We've slept in dust. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'd like to bathe. I'd lived with her long enough to know that she really meant you all need to bathe, but she was saying it nicely. Never put others on the defensive. They'll just dig in their heels. Her technique worked. There was a murmur of immediate agreement. Aoife laughed. Thank you, Joyce. And wash clothes, Mom said firmly. Some of you especially. She didn't name names, but she didn't have to. Sean looked at his shirt and sniffed experimentally. Dad chuckled. Well, seems reasonable. Francis nodded. The body must be cared for as well as the soul. They travel together. Claire looked at my mom approvingly. And it's the perfect day. We're not going far. Pearl waded into the shallow edge of the river immediately, as if to demonstrate enthusiasm. Boys and girls separate, I said, trying to sound authoritative and not amused. Agreed, Mom replied, already unrolling a bar of something from a cloth. Soap. Real soap. Ivory, I think, from the fragrance. The sight of it felt almost scandalous in the wilderness. We're not hauling full bath kits, Dad said mildly. Mom smiled with deep innocence. I packed light, and I have enough to share, she added, pulling another bar out of her pack. One for boys and one for girls. We split up naturally. The men moved upstream around a bend in the river. We women found a shallow inlet bordered by reeds and low stones that offered some modest cover. The water was shockingly cold. I stepped in carefully, feeling the riverbed shift under my feet. The current wasn't violent, but it had a mind of its own. Lucia gasped when she dipped her hands. It's freezing! It'll wake you up, Teresa said serenely. We worked quickly, sleeves rolled, scarves tied back. Mom lathered her arms vigorously and declared with satisfaction, there's nothing quite like washing in running water. It feels decisive. Claire was quieter. She knelt at the edge, cupping water over her wrists first, then her face. There was something reverent about the way she washed, not dramatic, just attentive. As I rubbed soap between my hands, I watched the foam gather and then slip away into the current. It formed little white swirls, bright against the darker water, and then disappeared downstream. It struck me suddenly that no matter how much soap we used, the river wouldn't hold on to it. The foam rose, shimmered briefly, and vanished. Isn't that odd? I said. What? Aoife asked. The river doesn't keep the soap. Teresa smiled faintly. Nor does it keep the dirt. We began washing clothes as well, beating them lightly against flat stones, wringing them out, our wet hair up in clasps or dripping freely. There was laughter when Lucia splashed Aoife deliberately, and Aoife retaliated. For a few minutes it felt carefree, ordinary. Then Pearl barked. Not her playful bark, her alert bark. We all turned at once. Across the river, near a thicket of low shrubs, Francis was crouched low, one hand extended carefully toward something in the brush. David stood a few feet behind him, watchful. I glanced around at all the girls. Thankfully, we were all dressed. Stay there, Dad called calmly to us. We'll check it. Naturally, that meant we strained to see. Francis moved slowly, whispering something under his breath. When he shifted aside, just enough, I caught a glimpse of mottled fur, creamy white streaked with dark brown, almost marbled. It's a polecat, Teresa said softly beside me. A what? Lucia asked. Marbled polecat, Teresa clarified. They're spirited. Pearl barked again, tail stiff. Mom held her collar or she would have gone into the river. Francis didn't touch it at first. He just lowered himself onto his knees and waited. After a long moment, he spoke quietly. You're injured. It's okay. Our father sent me to help you. David stepped closer. How badly? One leg, and frightened. That was obvious. The animal's body was low to the ground, muscles taut, eyes bright and furious. Francis, Dad called gently, you're not planning to bring that thing with us, are you? Francis glanced up with that expression that means, yes, of course I am. He does not wish to remain here alone. It's a wild animal, Sean said from downstream, already dressed and now curious. So are we, Francis replied lightly. Claire had waded carefully across the shallow river and had come up beside him now. She didn't rush. She just knelt near him and looked at the polecat. It's bleeding, she said quietly. How does she know? Aoife whispered to me. Because she notices everything, I whispered back. Francis looked at Claire. Will you help me? She nodded once. David sighed, though not unkindly. All right, let's see it. The polecat hissed when Francis moved closer. It bared small, sharp teeth and let out a high, furious sound that startled Pearl into retreating a step. Francis didn't flinch. Why is he so angry? Maria asked. Because he hurts, Teresa said. It makes him vulnerable. Claire reached slowly into her pouch and pulled out a strip of clean cloth. We'll need to clean it, she murmured. Mom looked at the soap still in her hand. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Francis smiled slightly. Perhaps the river is industrious after all. The cleaning of the polecat was neither tidy nor dignified. It bit Francis, not hard enough to break skin, but enough to earn a sharp intake of breath. See, Sean said, spirited. Francis laughed quietly. Yes, as he should be. Claire took over the washing. She cupped river water gently over the injured leg, using the smallest corner of the soapy cloth to remove caked dirt. The polecat trembled violently at first. Pearl paced in small, offended circles, clearly unsure how she felt about this intruder. The rest of us followed Claire across the river once we saw how shallow it was, except Mom, who stayed on our side of the river, holding Pearl's collar. What if it sprays? Aoife asked nervously. That, John of the Cross said calmly from a nearby rock, would be a lesson. We all laughed. Claire's hands were steady. She worked with deliberate patience, whispering something too soft for me to hear. After a few minutes, the trembling eased. The leg was indeed cut, though not deeply, probably caught in thorn or rock. Francis held the animal gently but firmly while Claire bound the leg with cloth. "You're washing him," I said quietly. Claire glanced up. "Yes, he doesn't want to be washed." She smiled slightly. "Most of us don't." Polecat let out one last indignant squeak and then went strangely still. "He'll have to travel with us," Francis said. "That's a terrible idea," Liam said immediately. "Why?" Francis asked. "It's wild. It'll cause problems." Francis tilted his head. "Do you cause problems, Liam?" Liam blinked. "Well, sometimes. And yet we do not leave you by the river." That shut him up. Pearl edged closer, sniffed cautiously, and then, to our collective amazement, lay down beside the polecat, though with exaggerated dignity. "Look at that," Mom whispered. Dad folded his arms, watching the scene. "Cleaning isn't always comfortable," he said quietly, "but sometimes it's the only way something survives." I looked at him. He wasn't preaching, he was just observing. The river flowed on, as if unimpressed. It had done its job with dignity and then continued on its way. As we gathered our things and prepared to walk, I couldn't shake the image of the soap dissolving into the current. The water didn't keep the foam, it carried it away, and the dirt with it. We walked under a canopy that grew denser as the morning progressed. The terrain shifted gradually from soft riverbank to firmer ground, scattered with rocks the size of fists and occasional outcroppings that forced us to step carefully. The forest here wasn't dark, but it was layered. Tall trees overhead, mid-level branches weaving throughout, and thick shrubs below. The air smelled of damp earth and crushed leaves. The polecat rode for a while in a makeshift sling David rigged from a spare scarf. Claire walked beside him, occasionally reaching up to steady the small bundle when it shifted. Francis walked near them, asking questions no one expected. "What does it feel like to be cleaned when you do not wish it?" he asked suddenly. "Cold," Aoife said immediately. "Embarrassing," Lucia added. "Necessary," Teresa said. "And afterward?" Francis pressed. "Relieved," I said, without thinking. He smiled at me. "Why?" "Because something that didn't belong is gone," I thought, but I didn't say it. Instead, I said, "Because you feel lighter." Francis nodded. "Yes." The polecat stirred in its sling, making a small irritated sound. Pearl trotted alongside, eyes fixed suspiciously on the bundle. And somewhere behind us, the river continued doing what it had done all morning, washing, carrying, refusing to keep what didn't belong. We had no idea yet that by afternoon we'd be back in that water again, and that this time it wouldn't be by choice. By late morning, the forest had warmed just enough to make you start unzipping jackets and regretting it 5 minutes later. That's how the day felt in general, like it kept offering you a choice and then changing the terms. The path narrowed into a natural corridor of scrub oak and pine. The soil turned from soft leaf mold to a rougher mix of stones and packed clay, and the air got drier as we climbed. We weren't going up a mountain or anything dramatic, but it was steady enough that you could feel it in your calves, and steady enough that you couldn't ignore your breathing. David walked with his pack like he always does, quietly, determinedly, like he's not trying to prove anything, but also like he refuses to be carried by anything but grace. I was sitting in my walker seat when we paused, hands resting on the handles, letting my breath settle. Mom was walking ahead on the right with a relaxed stride that made me a little crazy. She had walked like she had never heard the phrase pacing yourself. She walked like she had been born for long trails. She had once been clocked at an amazing 6 miles per hour on El Camino Real. She looked back at me and smiled that gentle smile of hers, and I knew she was enjoying herself. "Mom," I called. She turned slightly. "Yeah? You're not allowed to act 20." She laughed. "Then you're not allowed to act 80." Fair. Pearl trotted between us like a small, stout chaperone who took her job seriously. She kept glancing at the sling David wore, the marbled polecat bundle, as if waiting for it to confess something. The polecat, for its part, had discovered the power of stillness. It was like it had decided, if I don't move, none of you can make me do anything, which honestly was relatable. Claire walked close to David, her eyes flicking to the sling now and then. She didn't hover, but she stayed in range like a quiet mama would. Francis drifted in and out of our little clusters, asking questions the way some people throw pebbles into a pond, not to make noise, but to see what ripples you're carrying inside. He fell into step beside me as I resumed walking. "How is your body this morning, Alice Kay?" he asked. I lifted one shoulder. "It's doing what it can." He nodded. "And how is your spirit?" I considered making a joke. I considered it hard. Then I said, "It's cleaner than it was yesterday." He looked delighted. "Ah, don't get excited," I warned him. He laughed. I am always excited when someone notices such a thing. Ahead of us, Aoife and Lucia were talking quietly with Teresa and John. Every so often I caught a phrase, something about obedience, something about fear, something about how the Lord leads by invitation more than force, and I could tell Lucia was trying to pin the whole conversation down like a butterfly. Teresa wasn't letting her. Teresa was letting it fly. Sean and Liam had taken up a pace that suggested they were trying to outrun their own thoughts. Maria was walking with Francis off and on, and I liked seeing her with him. She was still careful around everyone, like she didn't want to take up too much space, but Francis had a way of making shy people forget they were shrinking. Dad walked near me for a while, matching my pace without making a fuss about it. That's one of his gifts. He'll be helpful without making you feel helped. "You okay?" he asked. "Yep." "Good." He didn't press. He never does. We walked for another hour, and the landscape began to open. The trees thinned in places, revealing long rolling stretches beyond the forest, pale winter grasses, rocky clearings, patches of green where some stubborn plant refused to quit. And then we smelled it. Mud. Wet earth. Not the normal forest damp. Something heavier, freshly disturbed. David slowed first. Francis slowed because David slowed. And then the rest of us slowed because Francis slowed. Because if Francis stops, you assume the universe is trying to tell you something. Pearl stopped dead and snorted. The polecat made a tiny offended squeak from inside the sling, like it sensed a problem and wanted credit for noticing it first. We came around a bend where the path should have continued straight through a shallow dip. Instead, the earth had moved. That's the best way to describe it. It looked like a giant hand had scooped the hillside and dropped it across the trail. Another mudslide. Ugh. Not enormous like the ones you see in news footage, not homes buried, not cars swallowed, but big enough that our path was gone, and big enough that the slope on either side of the slide looked unstable and slick. Was this going to be the theme for this walk? The mud was thick and dark and shining faintly in the light, like chocolate batter. My mother made a low sound in her throat that could have been reverence or appetite. "Mom, your chocolate frosting addiction is showing," I thought affectionately, but I knew she saw a challenge, and a challenge always thrilled her. Everyone stopped. No one wanted to be the first to step on it. It was one of those moments where the world feels suddenly quiet, like it's holding its breath to see who you'll be. Sean, naturally, went first. "Sean," Lucia started. "I'm just checking," he called back, already stepping onto the edge with the confidence of a boy who has never had consequences. His foot sank immediately. Not just a little. His boot disappeared up to his ankle like the mud had been waiting for him personally. He froze. The mud made a small sucking sound that was not encouraging. Liam burst out laughing. Sean tried to pull his foot out and nearly fell forward. Pearl barked sharply, scandalized. Francis didn't move yet. He just watched Sean with a look of mild interest, like he was watching a child learn gravity. "Do not fight it," John of the Cross said quietly, almost to himself. Sean turned, wide-eyed. "What?" John's gaze stayed on the mud. "If you fight too hard, you'll sink more." Teresa nodded once, as if John had just stated an obvious law of the universe. "It's like prayer." Lucia blinked. "How is mud like prayer?" Teresa smiled. "It reveals what you do when you feel powerless." Sean made another attempt to wrench his foot free. The mud took this personally. He sank a little more. "Stop," Dad said, not loudly, but with the kind of calm authority that makes you stop. Sean froze. Dad stepped to the edge, careful, testing the ground with the toe of his boot like he was negotiating with a suspicious dog. He looked back at Sean. Shift your weight back, slowly. Don't yank. Wiggle. Sean did it, cheeks red. His foot came free with a loud slop and a spray of mud that hit the back of Liam's pant leg. Liam's laughter died instantly. Sean looked at him with satisfaction. Pearl barked again as if to say, Justice has been served. But the problem remained. The path was gone. And for me, sitting in my walker, the problem wasn't just the mud. It was the slope, the slickness, the uncertainty. I could see where the ground had given way, and my mind went straight into logistics. How do I get across that? How does my walker get across that? How do we keep people from sliding? How do we keep Sean from making this into an Olympic sport? How do we keep the polecat from flying out of David's sling like a furious marbled comet? Nobody said any of that out loud, but I could feel the questions in the air like static. I wasn't the only one thinking them. Francis walked forward, not to solve it immediately, but to look at it like he was greeting it. Good day, he said softly to the mud. Aoife laughed under her breath. Is he talking to it? It's a habit, David murmured. He greets everything. Francis crouched at the edge and scooped a bit of mud with 2 fingers. He rubbed it thoughtfully. Then he held his hand up. Mud coated his skin. He stared at it and sighed dramatically. Oh no, Mom said. Don't you start. Francis turned to her with great seriousness. Sister Joyce. Mom looked at him curiously. Francis smiled and held up his muddy fingers. We have soap. There was a beat of silence, and then David's laugh came, surprised and warm. You think soap is going to fix a mudslide? Francis's expression was innocent. Not the mudslide. He held up his hand again. But it will fix this. Claire stepped beside him, her gaze moving over the terrain. We need a plan, she said quietly. Her voice had that effect. It made everything feel possible again, just because she sounded unpanicked. Teresa stepped forward, skirts gathered in her hands with practiced ease, and studied the slope like she was measuring a spiritual battlefield. John of the Cross stood behind her, looking not at the mud, but at the fence of trees to the left, where the ground looked firmer. Along there, he said. Aoife followed his gaze. There's a side trail. It wasn't a real trail. It was more like a suggestion. A narrow line where leaves were disturbed and a few stones had been kicked aside by something. Animal, person, wind, who knows, but it ran alongside the mudslide, hugging the edge of the forest. It would be tight. It would be uneven, but it wasn't mud. It was stable. Francis nodded. The narrow way again. Joyce groaned. You had to say it. I did, Francis admitted, completely unbothered. David looked at me. Can you do that side trail? I looked at it, then at my walker, then back at the trail. I could, maybe, if someone walked beside me, but they couldn't. The area was too narrow. If someone steadied the walker, but how could they if they weren't beside me? If we went slow, if the ground didn't crumble. I swallowed. Dad stepped closer without making a big announcement of it. I'll be right here. I nodded once. Mom, meanwhile, had wandered closer to the mud and was staring at it with a conflicted expression. What? Lucia asked her. Mom sighed dramatically. It looks like chocolate frosting. Oh my gosh, Aoife said, laughing. Joyce! Joyce shook her head firmly. I did not give up chocolate for Lent, but I am still not eating this. That might be the first truly holy thing you've done today, Liam said. Joyce turned and pointed at him teasingly. Don't test me, young man. Pearl barked, possibly in agreement. And then, because all things holy love timing, the polecat chose that moment to wiggle in the sling and let out a high, offended squeal that sounded like a tiny demon being exorcised. Pearl whirled and barked right back. David froze. Hey, hey, settle down. The polecat squeaked again. Pearl lunged forward 1 step, stopped, and sat trembling with contained indignation, staring at the sling like she was trying to outstare the polecat into repentance. Francis watched them like this was deeply meaningful. It is good, he said quietly. It is not good, David replied, though he was smiling. If this becomes a fight, I'm in the middle. Francis tilted his head. You are witnessing the beginning of peace. You're in the middle, therefore, you are a peacemaker. David glanced down at Pearl, then at the sling, then back at Francis. It looks like the beginning of a feud. Peace, Francis repeated, as if David had misunderstood a math problem. Claire touched David's arm lightly. Let me take him for a bit, she said. David carefully shifted the sling strap so Claire could hold it. Pearl stood and followed instantly, 2 feet behind Claire, eyes narrowed. The polecat squeaked again. Pearl made a sound that was not a bark, more like a growly huff, and I swear it sounded like, try me. Lucia leaned toward me. I can't believe this is our life. I leaned back. I can. We worked out a plan. The side trail would take most of us around the med slide. We'd go single file. We'd keep distance. We'd test the ground. Then we'd regroup at a clearing just beyond the slide where the path appeared again. For the mud itself, Francis wanted to cross directly. Not because he was reckless, but because he wanted to see if the mud was stable enough for anyone who couldn't manage the side trail, which I knew meant me, and maybe Dad, depending on the terrain, and honestly, anyone who slipped. He tested the mud with a long branch, prodding like he was checking a sleeping animal. It's steep, he said. No kidding, Sean muttered, still staring at his boot like it had betrayed him. Teresa stepped beside Francis, looking at the mud with a spark of recognition. You know, she said, this is how it feels when you think you're doing well, and then the Lord shows you a place you've been avoiding. Francis nodded slowly. And if you panic, John said, you sink. Eva looked between them. You two say the calmest things about the worst situations. Teresa smiled. We've had lots of practice. Lucia frowned. Practicing what? Teresa's eyes softened. Suffering. That quieted all of us, not in a heavy way, just in a true way. Dad glanced at Teresa. You were imprisoned, right? Teresa nodded. Yes. And you, Dad said, looking at John. John's expression didn't change, but his eyes deepened. Yes. There was a pause where the wind moved through the trees, rustling dry leaves like paper. And then Francis said lightly, and I was once scolded severely for stealing pears. Everyone looked at him. What? Maria asked. Francis shrugged. It was formative. Laughter bubbled up, and it loosened something in my chest, like the day had gotten too tight, too serious, and the laugh gave it room again. We began to move. Eva went first on the side trail, strong legs, steady balance. Lucia followed, Maria, then Liam. Claire went next, carrying the polecat sling like she was holding a fragile secret. Pearl followed her, vigilant. Teresa and John walked together, their pace unhurried, their presence strangely stabilizing, like the trail itself felt a little less dangerous because they were on it. Then Sean, who looked like he was trying to regain dignity one careful step at a time. David stayed near the back, watching everyone, then glanced at me. You ready? He asked quietly. I nodded. Yep. He stepped closer to my walker. I'll steady it. Dad stepped to my other side, and I'll steady you. Mom came up behind me, eyes bright, and I'll give commentary. That's what I was afraid of, I said. Mom laughed. You love it. I did. We started down the narrow side trail. It was tighter than it looked. The fence line of trees pressed in and the ground angled slightly, forcing careful steps. The walker wheels bumped over rocks. I gripped the handles. My heart did that thing that it does when my body is doing something my brain thinks is risky. I took one slow step at a time. David had to walk slightly ahead of me, his hand staying on the walker frame, not pushing, not pulling, just present. Dad's arm was near mine, close enough that I could grab him if I needed, but not so close that I felt managed. Mom walked behind, occasionally muttering, Careful, careful. Okay, that's a rock. Yep. Francis would call this inviting. I snorted despite myself. Halfway along, the ground shifted a little under one of the walker wheels. I froze. David leaned in. Don't fight it, he murmured, echoing John. Dad's voice stayed calm. Shift your weight back. Slow. I did. The wheels settled. My breath came out in a shaky laugh. Okay, I get it. Prayer, mud, don't panic. Mom called. Also, don't die. Also that, I agreed. The narrow trail narrowed further. Sean had stopped to make sure we made it through. He assessed the situation, grabbed my walker, and tossed it back to my mom, who actually caught it. It took me by surprise. What are you doing? Let me through, he said to David unceremoniously. He scooped me up and threw me over his shoulder. My eyes must have been huge. I heard David laugh and my mom giggle. Dad chuckled, and I knew he was shaking his head in amazement. Sean carried me a good quarter mile, and I am no light bag of potatoes. When the trail widened again, he set me down without so much as an apology. I think I still looked startled. Mom passed my walker to me, and we all walked on as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Soon the mudslide lay behind us like an ugly memory. I felt a strange surge of gratitude that had nothing to do with accomplishment and everything to do with companionship. I wasn't alone on hard ground, or soft ground for that matter. I hadn't been alone all day. The clearing beyond the mudslide was open and bright, dotted with stones and winter grass. We gathered there, drinking water, adjusting packs, checking on each other. Sean was wiping mud off his boot with a stick like it was a personal enemy. Liam was still laughing at him. Mom dug in her pack and handed him a bar of soap with a stern look. He handed it back. We'll see if we camp near a river. Maria sat on a rock, looking thoughtful. Claire sat beside her, the polecat sling resting across her lap. The little animal was quiet now, eyes half closed, as if exhaustion had finally outweighed suspicion. Pearl sat directly in front of Claire, staring at the sling like a guard dog assigned to a prisoner. David walked over and crouched near Pearl. You're going to have to share the world, he murmured to her. Pearl blinked slowly. The polecat chose that exact moment to poke its head out of the sling. Pearl's eyes widened. The polecat stared back. For one long second, they held eye contact like two rival kingdoms negotiating border rights. Then the polecat made a tiny, disgruntled sniff. Pearl huffed, and the polecat, without warning, reached out a small paw and tapped Pearl's nose. Pearl jerked back like she'd been insulted. Lucia gasped, "Oh my gosh." Aoife slapped a hand over her mouth, laughing. Pearl looked around at all of us, scandalized, like she was asking, "Did you see that?" Claire unbelievably smiled. Francis's eyes shone. "Peace," he whispered triumphantly. David leaned back on his heels. "Francis, that wasn't peace, that was an assault." Francis looked pleased anyway. It was contact. John of the Cross murmured, "It begins." Teresa nodded as if this was a recognized stage of spiritual development. Dad chuckled quietly. I'm going to pretend I understand what's happening. Mom leaned towards me. Pearl's met her match. I whispered back, Pearl has never had a match. This is going to be amazing.